All right. Thanks everybody for making it to the final session. And first of all, thank you so much for participating in a conference. I learned a lot. I hope you all learned a lot. And I hope also you'll learn a little bit now with the final presentation. And if you don't learn anything, I hope at least to keep you a little entertained. We'll see. But at least I'll start with a grand question, maybe an overly grand question, which is what drives policy change? Of course, not a new question at all, but it is still our motivating question for this joint topic with Tim Leslie, I should say, on the political economy of neoliberal narratives. So what drives policy change? From a theoretical point of view in political economy, standard models usually emphasize policy change due to political institutions and organizations, or shifting economic interests, or some new evidence changing beliefs that people have. In all these frameworks, beliefs of citizens are there in the background, but they are sort of, to some extent, mechanical, in the sense that the understanding of how the economy works is assumed to be fixed among citizens, usually. And given this sort of fixed belief about how the economy works, beliefs are assumed to be more or less evidence-based. Sometimes, they are imperfectly evidence-based, but they track evidence. So policy change in such models comes because of new evidence, largely. But of course, this is not really in the flavor of our conference here, because such models naturally limit the room for policy narratives to matter. And I just want to be clear, or a little bit clearer from the get-go, what we mean by narratives, because it's quite a vague concept. I'll be a lot clearer later when I show the formal framework. But roughly speaking, what do we mean by policy narratives? I think it's helpful to distinguish between a few set of terms. And for that purpose, I would like you to imagine a policy, which I think is any policy, which has multiple effects on different kinds of citizens. Each potential effect of a policy, out of this multitude, can be therefore described by a causal parameter. And of course, as economists, we are very we know causal parameters, at least in theory, very well. What is a policy narrative? A policy narrative is simply a combination of causal parameters into one particular subjective causal model. So in principle, any causal parameter can have many different values, but a policy narrative selects among all possible values one for each causal parameter. And then what is a belief in the model? A citizen belief is the choice of one particular policy narrative, i.e. set of parameters, over another. And the belief in a narrative will imply a policy preference, which I'll show you in a bit. All right, so I said narratives are sometimes a bit unclear. Neoliberalism as a term definitely is also often unclear. So again, I want to be precise now, at least to some extent, and then a lot more precise later. So what do we call neoliberal narratives? These are causal policy models with two key features. Firstly, they highlight what we call the trickle-down benefits of a policy. So they refer to policies which may harm poorer individuals, but have some compensating trickle-down effect, which can, as a result, have an indirect positive effect on poorer individuals. So that's the first element. The second element is that they question the ability of government to produce public goods efficiently, which naturally will lead to them advocating for other policy measures. The sort of history of neoliberalism, if you want to call it that, is fascinating, and there are many books on that. For instance, this book is very noteworthy. And arguably, it originated in post-World War I Vienna, which is the city I'm from. And you can actually trace it to the precise building where von Mises hired Hayek and others. They started talking about this. But anyway, this is where it originated. But for a long time, it was a fringe counterculture until arguably the rise of neoliberal narratives with Thatcher and Reagan. And later, So the rise was very much on the political right, but later neoliberal narratives were also adopted by the left, politicians like Blair or Clinton, who adopted it in a slightly different way, calling it something the third way. In a second, I come to the question. What I want to highlight is that now neoliberalism is often used as a pejorative term, but advocates of these sort of policies use the term positively at the start, and only later this became pejorative. This is, you can see this quote by Friedman. And this paper here, we don't make any normative statements about neoliberal narratives. You might think that by us using this term, this is sort of a normative paper, but it's not at all. Instead, we want to understand, well, we want to specify what are neoliberal narratives, and we want to understand on which conditions will they arise in a political equilibrium, leaving aside the question whether they are or are not good or correct or anything like that. I had a question there. Yes.
I don't know if you're trying to data, but in terms of thinking about, mentioning criticism.
Yes.
How do you think about this in the data? Is it about the intent of the policymaker, the politician, or is it about the content of the policy? Because many times this is more going to be about downstream who actually is affected by someone, and so intent is not really.
I think it will become clear in our conceptual framework. There is also, so this work relates to other work where I am doing empirical research, but having said that, today we will focus on the sort of theoretical framework, but please get in touch, and that's true for everybody, about the theory. We also use LLMs to study how these narratives emerge in political speeches over the last 100 years, roughly. But yeah, having said that, today the main contribution is to build a dynamic model of the demand of narratives and supply of narratives. And the way we build this is that we start with a very classical model of policy choice, where we have two parties, two policy dimensions, high and low income citizens, and probabilistic voting, so ingredients that are familiar to everybody. That's not non-standard, but what is non-standard is that we then add narratives to the model. Narratives, there's nothing new under the sun, of course, and narratives have also been studied, also theoretically, but not within sort of a canonical political economy framework. So we introduce narratives into a sort of canonical framework of political economy, whereas I said, narratives are subjective causal models, and we distinguish between narrative demand and narrative supply. Citizens will demand narrative and choose a narrative to believe in, and importantly, policymakers cannot just force you to believe in a narrative. It has to be in your willingness to buy into a narrative. The supply will come from politicians who strategically supply narratives to maximize the winning chance. All of this is more general, and in fact, I have now like a few other projects which use similar frameworks, but in this project, we apply it to what we call neoliberal narratives. And in particular, we want to then tell a story of the evolution of sort of policy narratives over roughly the last 100 years, so after the Second World War, and very broad sketches, of course. But what comes very naturally out of our model is this evolution from a post-war consensus on high regulation, high taxes, towards neoliberalism with policy polarization, and then a new potential consensus around the third way. So this is the story that I hope to tell you towards the end of my talk. But until we get there, we need a few building blocks. And by the way, I will also be focusing only on intuition. What I will do is I will lay out the framework, because I think the intuition doesn't make sense without seeing the framework. But then when it comes to the results, I'll only talk about the intuition of the results. And the interesting results come here when we talk about narrative dynamics. All right, so let's start with the model, just a few slides on the model. So the economy follows an earlier paper of Tim. It's very simply modeled. There are two types of citizens, low income, high income. And there's just some proportion of low income people, it's exogenous. And there are two policy dimensions, redistribution and regulation. in which parties will compete, and all of this is very standard as well. You can choose tax between some bounds, and you can choose what we call regulation between some bounds, where high X we will call deregulation. So low X is sort of a very highly regulated economy. With neoliberalism, we will have deregulation, so a shift towards high X. So what is X? All of this is also quite simple. X, again, which is deregulation, will have different effects on high-income and low-income people. For high-income people, X will increase their income by lambda X. For low-income people, X will decrease their income by minus lambda psi X. And here we already have two sort of causal parameters, which later will form part of the narrative. Lambda is sort of the importance of deregulation. So how much does deregulation, what is the potential of deregulation to increase or decrease incomes? Whereas psi is that sort of negative distributive effect onto the poor. So to what extent does deregulation harm the poor? It is interesting to limit the case to positive psi, because if psi can also be negative, then there is a sort of an interesting outcome where you just say deregulation is great for poor and for rich people, so there's no trade-off. Instead, we study.
Isn't the trickle-down narrative exactly that?
I'll define very precisely what the trickle-down narrative is in a little
Not
bit.
on the side, because my first reaction.
It'll be on the next slide, I think. Yeah. So just bear with me for a second. But yeah. So this is private income, but that's not the only thing in the utility function. The aggregate economy is just the weighted average of high income and low income people, and the aggregate economy matters because, well, private incomes will be taxed, and this tax expenditure will go into the provision of public goods. So G of X will be equal to T times aggregate income Y times gamma, and gamma is the third causal parameter in the model, which is sort of the efficiency or valuation of the public good. So now to your question, what is the trickle down condition? Well, a necessary condition for trickle down to hold is that even though some poor people might, the private incomes might be smaller, the aggregate economy will rise, and through that, there'll be a compensating effect even on the poor incomes, which means that their utility can be overall larger. So that's where the trickle-down effect comes. And of course, the trickle-down effect necessitates that psi is not too large, because if psi is very big, then you can never compensate it. So it's sort of a limit on psi. But I'll talk more about the trickle-down effect later.
Is it important that you will allow for progressive taxation?
No, I don't think this will be important, no. In fact, our baseline model fixes taxation. Our baseline model fixes taxation, so it's exogenous, but then we have a model with endogenous taxation and endogenous deregulation as well. All right, so that was citizens. Hopefully that's clear. Politics is also very simple, and that follows, again, sort of standard literature. There are two parties, L and H, representing low-income interests or high-income interests, and they choose these policies, deregulation and taxes. And there will be standard probabilistic voting, which I won't get into, but it just means that there will be a shock and voters will vote for the party that gives them then higher utility subject to that shock. There will be no commitment, so the equilibrium policies of each party will follow what the people that they represent, so high income or low income people, what they want. So parties are sort of slaves to the people they represent in this model, insofar as they cannot persuade them of narratives. But the interesting thing will happen when parties will compete in narratives in order to persuade citizens of a certain narrative, which then makes it also a commitment device to implement a certain policy. Yes?
I mean, later they will have a platform and then they will have a commitment to them.
No, so we will assume no commitment, but they can compete in narratives, and that's like commitment, as you'll really see later. Okay, so what are narratives in this model? Narratives in our model are subjective causal models. and they reflect competing views of how outcomes are affected by policy. And what we're tapping into here is the fact that many debates within political economy, especially, are quantitative. So in some of the literature around narratives, which you might know, like Elias and Spiegler, which is a seminal contribution, the narrative is sort of a arrangement of variables into a directed acyclical graph. And the question of a narrative is what causes what. But in many questions of political economy, I don't think we are actually so interested in what causes what, but to what extent does something cause something. So these are the sort of debates that we're capturing here. All right, so I'll give you an intuitive interpretation of what narratives are. But as I said before, there are these three causal parameters which appear in the utility function, and a narrative is going to be a particular combination of these causal parameters. So I think this figure illustrates it very simply. So in the model, deregulation has an effect on high-income people, on low-income people, and all of this affects average income. And then government efficiency affects to what extent average income actually matters to people because of the tax revenues and public health. So a narrative will be a particular selection or a story of the sizes of all of these things. All right, so hopefully it's clear what narratives are in our framework. Now the question is, how do citizens form beliefs? What happens in our model is that citizens choose the narrative out of everything that they see politicians say, which maximizes their expected utility. So that's all that this says. So citizens will see all the narratives that are available, and they choose the narrative that is in their interest to believe, taking into account what the likely policy outcome is. So it's just maximizing the sort of expected utility. Especially
a bit confused. You mentioned there are two parties, but there are many possible narratives. So there are like political entrepreneurs who provide these narratives, or
this will come next. This will come in a second. Sorry. Yeah. So there's the demand. The supply will come from parties. It comes now. So it'll come later. Sorry. So as I said, parties will just choose the policy which ex post maximizes the utility of citizens, conditional on what these citizens believe. So parties will take into account what their citizens believe, and then conditional on that, implement the policy that maximizes their utility. So that's why narratives matter in a sort of last stage of the model. I'll come to your question in a second. So this is the model outline if narratives are just exogenously given, which relates to your question later, which is a much more interesting part of the framework. There will be competition in these narratives, but I'll go through the static framework first to give you intuition of what happens, and I will go through the full dynamic model.
Go back to your demand for narratives. I'm trying to see, so am I understanding correctly that here it's only based on your material benefits that you choose?
So you choose so before you vote, you choose the narrative that you sort of wish to believe in. It's built on motivated reason. That's
okay, because one of the reasons I'm asking is because you can refer that. Since you started, I kept thinking that as much as I truly believe that material sense, I feel that they anchor into some kind of big assumptions about the world. In the case of neoliberal narrative, into the meritocratic society, is individual. And so in a sense, there's narratives coming from those type of beliefs of those priors. They can match it, or they can maybe shift it, which is super interesting. But I guess like this underlying dimension is, if I'm understanding correctly, kind of absent here.
So your concept of a narrative just seems to be much grander, which is fine. We speak of a policy narrative, so it's applied. You could think that there are these policy narratives correlate. We know, of course, that by now, if I know your opinion on one policy issue, I probably can predict all policy issues. We could incorporate this into the model, but all it will do is sort of delay the time at which you switch from one narrative to another without really adding any more but that's how you can think about this. But yeah, here we zoom in on a policy narrative about deregulation and taxation, which I think is already quite a big sort of set of narratives, but it doesn't encompass like identity and.
No, to a certain extent, that would be, I think it's interesting. That would be interesting. This type of dynamics end up affecting the fundamental. Because eventually, if you hear narratives about your material interest,
yeah,
that's probably impacting.
Yeah, they would.
These assumptions.
In a model where we incorporate more things, at some point people would switch, but there will be more of a friction in switching. Yes.
Just as the end restriction on the plausibility of the narrative.
Yes. Yeah, so there will be chosen within bounds, and these bounds, you can think the parameters are sort of within bounds, and these bounds you can think in several ways. One way is to think of it as different sorts of evidence, right? One paper says this, one paper says that. Another is just a confidence interval across an estimate. Another one is something like the Overton window. What is acceptable to say in a society, which also shifts, but there are these bounds, and you'll see it in more detail later. Okay, so now let's zoom in the static model where, as of now, politicians do not supply narratives. Let's assume that there are just two narratives. Later, I'll expand it to the whole set of possible narratives. But just to fix ideas, let's assume that people can choose between two causal models. And we call these two causal models the post-war consensus narrative and the neoliberal narrative. And to simplify things, just assume that each parameter can be high or low. It doesn't really matter if you assume a continuum, but just think of high or low, lambda, high or low, psi, gamma. All right, so the post-war consensus, we think, roughly captures the world after 1940, or not the world, the Anglo-Saxon world after 1945, and much of Europe as well. The neoliberal narrative perhaps captures Reagan, Thatcher, etc. And they're opposite narratives. Okay, first lambda. The neoliberal narrative says that deregulation can do a lot, whereas the post-war consensus narrative questions that. Psi, the post-war narrative says if we deregulate, it's going to harm a lot of people, whereas the neoliberal narrative says, well, there might be some harm, but it's not very big. And then, of course, gamma, the neoliberal narrative views the state as less efficient, whereas the post-war consensus has this sort of consensus of high state efficiency. I think it's easiest to think about these things just in this narrative space. So remember that this is sort of how you can summarize our causal models in terms of the space of how deregulation affects outcomes. What parameters does the neoliberal narrative choose? Well, it says that, that we start with a post-war consensus narrative in a sort of 1940s, okay? What does it say? Well, it says that deregulation won't raise the incomes of high-income people much, but it would harm low-income people, all right? So the combined effect is that per capita income would actually decrease from deregulation. It also says that actually tax revenue is very valuable. So the policy implication is that we should have strong regulation and high taxes. So that's how you can think of this here. What about the neoliberal narrative? The neoliberal narrative says deregulation raises high-income people's income and doesn't harm much the income of low-income people, such that there is a trickle-down effect where the per capita income is higher under deregulation. And it also says that, well, if we tax this per capita income, it's all wasted anyway by the government. So we should not trust in taxation and instead deregulate and increase incomes through that avenue. So that's the neoliberal narrative on deregulation. And what is if people can only choose between these two types of narratives in a model, what happens then? Whether the neoliberal narrative is or isn't attractive to people depends on the state of the economy. Under a good economy, the post-war consensus is actually more attractive relative to the neoliberal narrative in the model. Why? Because with a big economy, the government output is non-trivial, But the neoliberal narrative posits that government is super inefficient. So believing in it would say that all this tax revenue gets wasted. So it's actually not very beneficial to believe in the neoliberal narrative when there's a big economy, which means big tax revenues. So the precondition for appeal of the neoliberal narrative is actually that the economy tanks. Because once the economy tanks, then the neoliberal narrative is quite hopeful about what can be achieved from deregulation. And at the same time, under a smaller economy, believing in low government efficiency is not very costly because believing in it doesn't lead to a belief that there's a lot of waste of government revenues. So the implication of that is that post-war consensus remains attractive when the economy is doing well, and there should be a consensus on regulation and high taxes. Whereas neoliberalism becomes more attractive once or a necessary condition is that the economy tanks. And this brings us to the more interesting part of the paper, which is narrative dynamics. And if I'm not mistaken, I have 12 minutes, which is just about right, because we started 5 minutes.
More.
Sorry?
You have like 16.
16 minutes. Okay, well, okay. I'll try to take no, I'll try to take 12, don't worry. 12 should be enough. So we were in a static world until now, where there are just these narratives and people chose between them, and maybe we have a cute result about neoliberalism, but there's nothing interesting happening. I'll plan it now. But now let's assume that instead of this boring world, parties can actually introduce or emphasize a new narrative during a campaign. So the way we think about it is that parties deploy narratives. Once a narrative is deployed, it becomes part of the political space and everybody can see it. And then people choose from this set of narratives. So over time, the set of available narratives can expand. And what we do now is we assume that parties can choose any narrative. So again, narratives can be, each parameter can be low or high. Right? There are 3 parameters, so there are 8 possible narratives. 2 of them are already described, post-war consensus and neoliberalism. Out of the remaining 6, this one is also noteworthy. This is the narrative that we call the third way. So it disagrees with neoliberalism on gamma. The third way narrative says that gamma is high, but otherwise it agrees with neoliberalism. It says that, if we deregulate, then high-income people will get a lot of more money, low-income people won't be harmed so much, so it's good for the economy. But they also say, but then we can use all this bigger economy to redistribute, and it's going to be great for everybody. So that's the sort of the third way, if you want, Blair-Clinton narrative. Okay. So these 3 out of the 8 are noteworthy, but in the model, the parties can deploy any of the 8 possible narratives. All right, so this is a repetition from before about the post-war consensus narrative and the neoliberal narrative. Now, the difference with the third way narrative is that it doesn't think it's wasteful tax revenue, but instead it's valuable tax revenue. So the policy implication is on deregulation and on high or higher taxes. Right, so what will happen in this model now is that in every period, each of the 2 parties decides whether to supply a new narrative. And after that, people observe the whole set of narratives and they make the choices just like before. So the only difference before is that the set of narratives is endogenously expanding. And then we have a set of additional assumptions that we can talk about, but they're just technical, which is that if a narrative is deployed, it succeeds only with some probability. And we can talk about why that matters. It doesn't really matter. If we don't have this, then everything is only a mixed strategy equilibrium, which I think is not as nice, but the intuition is exactly the same. With this, we can have some pure strategy equilibrium because this basically makes it a mixed strategy equilibrium, right? If your strategy only succeeds with some, but it makes just to say we're not really hiding anything for this P, it's just sort of exposition. This is a dynamic infinite game. We'll have a Markov perfect equilibrium where strategies depend on the state space, and the state is simply the set of available narratives. So there can be 1 narrative, 2, 3, or all 8, or any combination of them. And this is the timing, as I said before. So within each period, as the parties will just communicate the narrative, and then everything else happens. Now, there are a couple of questions. I think yours was before. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm still a bit confused about the choosing of the narratives, like
Yes.
the way that the voter interprets their utility as if the narrative were true and computes their utility
Yeah,
and then decides whether that's better for them.
that's right. So
And it's independent of what, like, for example, if like tax review has always been zero, so you can never experience government spending.
Yeah.
That doesn't, like, versus a world where you have been experiencing it, the fact that you have experienced it or not is irrelevant for how you interpret someone saying it's good or bad.
So it is a model of anticipatory utility, and we could complicate the model to tell you the story of why this matters. So think of a world where outcomes are not perfectly observed, right? You see GDP goes up and down. It can have to do something with deregulation, or with tax revenues or whatever. But also at the same time, I don't know, Brexit is happening. There's a war. The stock market is crashing or rallying. There are a million things happening. So in any period, actually, there's a range of narratives which could be consistent with the outcomes that you observe. So I would like you to think of this as being sort of bounded, right? So we operate in this world where narratives, where for any given set of outcomes, there is a range of narratives which are sort of potentially in line with these outcomes. And that's different to how normal political economy models work, where sort of beliefs are basically slaves to the data. And I think there's a lot of great insights from that, but I think there's also some insights we can only get from this sort of approach where we allow beliefs to be sort of more motivated in some sense. Okay. All right, so what's the logic of the dynamic model? What causes politicians to yes.
It's like one sort of.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
There's this great book story.
Right.
So basically, this story is that basically like policy is there's a pretty then like sort of the weaker policies manifest. So in a time of like action, that's which is like this is the sense. And then that seems to be sense.
Yeah.
And you get then this policy vision against this sort of 90s and then 2000. So you get switched to something.
So that's a story of sort of a narrative not being consistent with data and a new narrative emerging, which is also what's happening here. But I think what this model allows us to say, why would the neoliberal out of all narratives emerge after the post-war consensus, and why would then after that the third way emerge? But having said that, of course, I don't think that this is the only model of policy narratives over the last 100 years. I think there are a few stories consistent with that, but I think this is one take on it. Yeah. All right, so what's the logic of the dynamic model? Why would politicians supply new narratives? Importantly, in period 0, we start with only one narrative being available, and that's the post-war consensus narrative. So that's where we start, and then parties can deploy any other narrative, okay? So what's the logic of the model? When there's only one narrative, then everybody believes in it, and as a result, parties will agree on the narrative and on the policy. So both parties will implement the same policy. There is no distinction between the parties. And as a result, each wins with probability 1/2 because the parties are indistinguishable. So it follows that, if you, in this world or in any other world where people agree on the narrative and the same policies follow, there's no electoral advantage. So in our model, the only reason for a politician or the only way to get an advantage for a politician is if they can offer a polarizing narrative, which is only believed by some citizens, but not by others, because this leads to policy polarization as well, where one party will support one set of policies and the other another set of policies. So in a model, there are only two types of narratives that will ever be deployed in equilibrium. Those that polarize opinion, so only some people believe in it and others don't, which lead to an electoral advantage to one of the parties. And those which counter this polarization and therefore close the gap in electoral advantage. And what comes out of the model is that, again, we have 8 possible narratives, but starting with a post-war consensus, only the neoliberal narrative can actually be polarizing, while only the third way narrative optimally counteracts this polarization. So among all possible paths that would in principle be feasible, there are really only 2 paths. Either, if the economy is always doing well, forever you stay in the post-war consensus. Or if the economy tanks, then the right party deploys the neoliberal narrative. For a while, it'll enjoy an electoral advantage. And then to close the electoral advantage gap, the left party deploys the third way narrative, and you have a new consensus on deregulation. Or the party preempts the neoliberal narrative and you go to the third way straight away. So instead of dwelling on this figure, let me walk you through the intuition, and then I'll be done, I think, before my time. So what is intuition? When the economy is doing well, neoliberalism is not polarizing for the reasons that I already said, because nobody wants to believe in neoliberalism when the economy is doing very well. So that means that forever the post-war consensus will remain. So the question is then, what can break the post-war consensus? Well, let's consider a decrease in the economy. This is also in line with the interpretation of, well, people like Milton Friedman, who said, only a crisis produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So, the neoliberal narrative could have in principle been deployed before, but only after a crisis does it become polarizing. And then that is the time when it actually becomes electorally advantageous for the right party to deploy it. So after a crisis, the right party will deploy the neoliberal narrative. And the state space evolves from a state where we only have the post-war consensus narrative to one where we have a post-war consensus and a neoliberal narrative. In this state, the right party, as I said before, has an electoral advantage, so that the left party wants to best respond. And it turns out that the best response is to deploy the third way narrative, which is sort of even more optimistic than the neoliberal narrative, because it says, well, the best world is deregulation and high gamma. Okay, so the last sort of insight, which also comes from the model, and I think this is maybe a deeper insight, is that there is a natural form of hysteresis which comes out of this model and any similar model of narrative deployment. Because let's think of an economy which is doing well, then it tanks, and then it recovers, okay? So the economy at the start and the end period is exactly the same. But in our model, actually, the policy can shift forever. Because what happens when the economy tanks is that the neoliberal narrative suddenly becomes attractive to a party. They will deploy it. Then the best response will follow of the third way. So even once the economy has recovered, the policy equilibrium is permanently changed. And we think that this is part, of course, not the whole story, but perhaps part of the story of what happened in this sort of evolution from the post-war consensus to neoliberalism to the third way. You had a question.
There's something about once you propose a new narrative, it's always there.
That's right. But even if there is limited memory and only the latest narratives stay, then you have the same. All right, so I'm happy to conclude here. So I hope to show you a way to think dynamically of narrative demand and supply in a political economy framework. And I think that this is one sort of story of how and why the world or Anglo-Saxon world transition from this post-war consensus to the neoliberal narrative to a third way. And there are so this applies to neoliberal narratives, but I think there are some more general insights perhaps, which is that the incentives to deploy narratives depend on the state of the economy, but once a narrative is deployed, it forever can alter the political landscape and permanently change policy equilibrium, so narratives can act as a sort of source of hysteresis. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.